So good afternoon, good day to everyone joining the online conference on Belarus today. I'm very happy to greet all the attendees, and I'm even more thankful for the speakers that have agreed to join us today. My name is Elizabeth. I am one of the leaders of the Belarus Research Network for Neighborhood Policy, who is organizing this event today. We are very kindly hosted by one of the consortium members, the Danish Foreign Policy Society, and I thank you for that. I would very briefly want to say that we, as the Belarus Network of Neighborhood Policy, have been operating since June 2022, and we have already produced several analytical and news digests on Belarus. And in fact, when the network was established with the support of the Nordic Council of Ministers in Denmark, its purpose was to raise Belarus on the regional agenda. And this event, in fact, is doing just that. Whereas we all very firmly stand with Ukraine, we understand that the peace and freedom in the region, both in the north and east, cannot be achieved without achieving complete freedom of choice in all countries of the region. And this is exactly what we are aiming to discuss today. Very quickly, giving some rules for the discussion to all the audience, we kindly ask to type your questions in the chat. I will be looking through your questions very attentively and passing them on to the moderator. Everybody will have a chance to ask their question. And I am sure that the very distinguished speakers that we have invited today are going to provide lots of input for a fruitful discussion. And with having said this, I would like to pass the floor to Lisa Dubinka-Husha, who is also another head of our network, who is going to give the perspective of Belarusians on what is actually happening at the moment. Thank you very much. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today, be one of the voices of Belarusian people. I will start by a short introduction. My name is Lizaveta Dubinka-Husha, and I'm an associate professor at European Humanities University and Copenhagen Business School, and part of this wonderful network that Elizabeth has just introduced. We all know that the most significant aspect of a region security, or in terms of security complex, is, to use political science terminology, is the security, the so-called security complex. That is when governments consider that their primary security concerns are so intertwined that their national securities cannot realistically be considered apart from one another. By the end of the 20th century, the Baltic Sea region, and the Baltic Sea was very close to becoming a lake in the EU. The powers surrounding the Baltic Sea region have more often historically been brought together in conflict than cooperation. And today, the Baltic Sea region includes the littoral Baltic states, the Nordics, Germany, Poland, and Belarus. I've mentioned, well, that the powers surrounding the region have always, or more often, been in conflict than in cooperation. Empires think and act geopolitically, we know. And to paraphrase the heartland theory proposed by Harold Mackinder, if Russia is holding the key to Belarus, then Lukashenko is holding the matches to set the region on fire, if he admits the direct involvement into the Russian war on Ukraine. This controversial position is a backwash of the policy that was actively exercised by Belarusian authorities in the period of 2008-2014, known as situational neutrality or hedging. The foreign policy of Belarus is known for its overall pro-Russian character, tempered by balancing-like fluctuations towards the best in between the election periods. The main expression of this balancing was traditionally a friendly relationship with Ukraine, articulated in numerous assurances by Lukashenko that no attack on Ukraine would launch from the Belarusian territory. However, when the usual room for maneuver shrank after the elections in August 2020, balancing and even hedging became impossible. Well, then why is Belarus so important for Russia and for Baltic Sea region? The war in Ukraine has shown that Belarus is an important space on the map of Europe, without which it would not be possible for Russia to carry out its offensive on Ukraine, the central and western parts of Ukraine, nor would it be possible for Russia to have a buffer between itself and the Baltic members of NATO surrounding the Kaliningrad region on the one hand and bordering Belarus on the other. Therefore, it is rather the Belarusian territory that presents this major value, interest for Russia with this regard, and is used as a springboard in its attack on Ukraine. When we look into the inner political situation, the period of repressions started after the elections in 2020 continues, and well, the regime practices repressions of civil society, and the situation is dominated by the position of the security forces in Belarus. When we speak about Belarusians' attitude towards the war, the Belarusian society at large shows huge support for Ukraine, although not explicitly, while Russia is perceived as an aggressor. And this is not only in the diaspora communities of Belarus outside, but also inside the country, as our insights tell us. And therefore, the situation in Belarus can be called a hybrid occupation by Russia. Belarus, as we know, was used as changed its neutral status as a result of the constitutional referendum in February 2022, in parallel with the Russian attack on Ukraine. It is difficult to say whether Lukashenko wanted the Belarusian military to fight side by side with the Russian military. I believe that Russia definitely expected some sort of involvement or support in one way or another, especially if we recollect the military situation on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, and this column that was standing there and waiting, the Russian column. It would be difficult for the Russians to advance without having a bridge there, and they definitely expected the Belarusian troops if it was necessary. But on the other hand, the situation in the Belarusian army itself was not that favorable for such decisions. And in fact, there are also insights that Belarusian military didn't want to join the Russian army directly in the war in Ukraine. And they were even scolded by Lukashenko at some point that they were not, he said, with someone like you, NATO will eat us soon. Well, whether it was a strategy or tactic, it would be difficult for me to say, but overall, as a Belarusian, I think that it was the mood of the Belarusian society that stopped further involvement of Belarus in this aggression, and in the general mood about among the population, as well as the army, is that this is not our war. From the point of view of, well, taking another layer, the layer of decision makers. Well, for Lukashenko himself, the vital interest is his own security, his own safety. So let us not forget that here he's primarily interested in preservation of his own power and the power of his clan within the governing, and in general preserving the governing structure in Belarus, where belonging to various political power structures is the main social lift in the society. So it would be fair to say that Lukashenko actually needed and still needs the military to stay in Belarus. And that is probably also one of the reasons why he did not involve directly. There is an important element in the economic structure of Belarus dependent on the Russian, dependent on the turnover of Russian oil products and resale of Russian gas, and it is primarily the pro-Russian lobby in Belarus is represented by those who participate in turnover of those products. According to some sources, the Belarusian regime receives and transfers overseas about $3 to $4 billion from this trade. Now, to the Russian perspective, it is unclear whether Putin regime really wanted to draw Belarusian troops into direct participation in war against Ukraine. Belarusian army consists of about 45,000 soldiers, out of whom 15 up to 20,000 are combat ready. And well, it could have been a significant support in the very beginning of the war. It could impact the situation near Kiev, as they were claiming to finish the war in 3 days. But apparently the situation turned out differently. And now well, perhaps we can still see the effect of a very small room of maneuver that Lukashenko retained by not participating directly with the troops, but in his wish to preserve power, subduing other parts of Belarusian sovereignty. Well, a few days ago, or to be precise, on the 25th of March, on the Belarusian National Independence Day, Putin announced deployment of nuclear weapons on the Belarusian territory, of Russian nuclear weapons. That was in parallel with Finland joining NATO. And that brings me to my next point, the point of historical and geopolitical axis, the so-called Ponto-Baltic connection system. Black and Baltic seas are connected. If we can draw a line going from the Gulf of Riga through the swamps of Belarus, further south along Carpathian hills and down to the Black Sea. The old route, by the way, and this whole axis, the Ponto-Baltic conflict system, means that this balance is happening on the one side of the system, cause discrepancies or fluctuations on the other side. I would also like to look at it from the game theory perspective, because when we look at the situation of conflict or cooperation, or the choice between conflict and cooperation in this region, it is difficult, if not irrational, to demand from someone, to demand cooperative behavior from someone who is, without providing strong, permanent external support for cooperation as such. So cooperation is hindered by distrust and suspicion born out of historical experience. And therefore, the continuation of conflicts in the Baltic area gives strong impulses to the Ponto-Baltic conflict system as a whole, translating into Russian-Ukrainian war, tensions in Transnistria, Caucasus, and so on. So where is the place of Belarus here? Look at this geopolitical and historical axis. I remember a crime drama where a dead body is found on the bridge between Denmark and Sweden. And since it is located right on the border with one half of the body on one side and the other half of the body on the other side, no one can take responsibility for investigating this crime. It is important for small states like Belarus, like Denmark, to establish themselves in international community, to get results, even if you don't have any military power. And for a long time, Belarus was thought of a country that was, in fact, or could be a bridge between the West and the East. I already mentioned the strategies of balancing and hedging. Back in 2014, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko tried to position Minsk as a dialogue platform. Unfortunately, the so-called Minsk protocols did not bring expected results to Ukraine. And as we can observe now, the biggest beneficiary of this process was, in fact, Russia, as it delayed Ukraine's integration into transatlantic organizations like EU and NATO. Russia also gained more and more control over Belarus. The only achievement of the Minsk dialogue was probably gaining the time by Ukraine to strengthen its combat capabilities. After February 2022, any illusion that Belarus could be neutral disappeared. A couple of days ago, we also saw visits by Russian military and intelligence authorities visiting Belarus and speaking about sort of defending Belarusian territory as if it was their own. So to conclude my short presentation of a Belarusian perspective, both as a Belarusian, but also as a political scientist, I would like to to say that the security of Baltic Sea region, but also of Europe at large, has been in the hands of a small, overlooked nation. And I would like to underline small, balancing or imitating the balance between East and West as an essential link in between the Baltic and the Black Seas, the Ponto-Baltic axis. Therefore, I believe that the key to Belarus action space lies in Kiev today. I'm following closely, especially the situation near Bakhmut. I think we'll see some signs from there. And well, in the event of Ukrainian victory, this might unlock the biggest Russian nightmare of the European Union stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, including the territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By this, I will put a full stop. I thank you for your attention, and I give the floor further to Elisabetta or Ugis.
No, that would be me. That would be me. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for your insights. And it was very wide, I would say, from the European perspective. And yes, my name is Udis, and I'm an associate researcher in Latvian Institute of International Affairs. And for more than 20 years, I have been also a journalist and of international affairs. And Belarus has been very close to my heart for more than 10 years, and my friends are still in jail in Belarus. And just months before the Russian invasion, I was standing on the cross points of three borders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and all the border guards and local inhabitants were saying that no invasion is possible through this point because we are protected. And just months later, this exact border crossing was used by Russian tanks to enter Ukraine from the Belarus side. And actually, if we look around here, we are representatives here from very wide region, and probably it doesn't even matter where are we coming from and what we exactly do, being me journalists, you political scientists, or whatever you do. But we all have one common goal, and it's to talk about this worrying situation in Belarus and to look for possible solutions as much as we can. And from the other side, it is very important for us because we are coming from the region that neighbors Belarus. It is a very close or even direct neighbor of us for Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. And that means that we should care more, and most probably we also might know something more about the situation in Belarus, and we could probably come up with some ideas and bigger or better understanding of the situation from our perspective. However, thoughts and opinions might differ from one country to another, and this is why we have organized this event. And in this moment, I would like to give a floor to Hanna Lyubkova, who is my colleague, I would say, Belarusian journalist, analyst, and non-resident fellow of Atlantic Council. And in the past year, she has written about developments in Belarus for the Washington Post, Economist, Open Democracy, and Controversial Analysts. And she has also worked in independent Belarusian channel Belsat TV. And I really think that it is a very useful that we as journalists can sometimes be those people who start the discussion about challenging and probably not very easy topics. And that gives us some space also to ask some difficult questions or give some food for thought. So this time, our main focus is Belarus, an occupied country. So, Hanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for organizing and hosting this event. This is very important to raise attention about Belarus, especially in the context of most recent developments. My introductory speech will last around 10 minutes, at least I'm setting my phone for that. I want to make it easier for you guys because I imagine that it might be really difficult to stare at the screen for such a long time. So I built my speech around three main areas. This is the significance of Belarus for European and Ukrainian security, the latest developments around nuclear weapons and the war, participation of the regime in the war against Ukraine, and the internal situation and repression in Belarus. And what was important for me, my goal was to give some recommendations, give a vision of how policy towards Belarus might look, and discuss some practical steps that hopefully will kick off the great discussion with brilliant panelists today. So let me start with the latest announcement on nuclear weapons that Putin made on the 25th of March, that Moscow had struck a deal with Belarus to station tactical nuclear weapons. While this was making headlines, Lukashenko was actually remaining silent for days. And only after a week, he addressed the nation and the parliament. And he said that he intensified talks with Putin on stationing both nuclear and strategic weapons in Belarus. But I think what was really drawing attention is this sort of rare public contradiction between the two dictators. While Putin was saying that Russia, Moscow would maintain control over its nuclear arsenal in Belarus, Lukashenko said that Belarus would be in charge. Many analysts said immediately that that was a blackmail, that was a bluff from the side of Moscow. But I would like to remind you that Putin already said that that Russia helped modify Belarusian aircraft to be able to carry nuclear weapons, and it also delivered Iskander tactical missiles that are capable to launch nuclear weapons. So clearly, the Kremlin is escalating its rhetoric, is escalating its nuclear blackmail, because it apparently doesn't have enough more tools to persuade the West to stop sending its military aid to Ukraine. Nevertheless, even though it might be a bluff, Belarus will feel the consequences if a full-fledged permanent base with Russian nuclear weapons is stationed in Belarus. Brussels already warned Minsk of further sanctions. Belarus could face retaliatory strikes if the war in Ukraine escalates and NATO countries would be involved. So imagine Belarusian nuclear weapons storage facilities, infrastructure, military airfields would become the first potential target in this scenario. And of course, Belarus is becoming more dependent on Russia. So I was thinking about several things, immediate responses that might be made. Of course, the democratic forces said that it violates the sovereignty of Belarus, and they strongly criticized that, and what can be done. So I thought about 4 points. So first of all, the UN Secretary General and its specialized bodies should take measures on legal assessment of the placement of nuclear weapons in Belarus. The EU Parliament can adopt a resolution condemning the decision of Russia to deploy nuclear weapons. Of course, neighboring countries such as Poland, the Baltic countries, and Ukraine would be directly threatened by that deployment. So it would be, I think, really useful for them to come up with a coherent, consistent strategy and a plan of actions. For example, they might consider organizing an international conference to draw attention to that issue. And of course, economic and diplomatic pressure is key, and I would discuss it a bit later. So the war against Ukraine and Belarus, the regime's participation in it, Lisa already discussed it, but what I think is important is, of course, without Belarus, it would be hard for the Kremlin to launch a full-scale invasion in February 2020. What we should not forget about is that Lukashenko provided full-scale support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. So he offered territory and infrastructure for attacks, as well as training, medical and housing facilities for Russian conscripts. The Belarusian regime delivered military equipment and munitions to Russia, and the regime allowed Russian troops and equipment to be stationed in Belarus on a permanent basis. The Russian offensive on Kiev, launched from the territory of Belarus last year, showed the significance of Belarus for Ukraine's safety. It's obvious that Russia will use Belarus and the presence of Russian troops in our country to threaten Ukraine, be it planning a new attack or launching missiles or just sort of drawing away attention from more critical areas at the moment. So what can be done? Here are some 4 ideas, but of course the list might be much longer, and hopefully the panelists would also discuss it. So first of all, Lukashenko must be labeled as a threat to international peace and security. He is a co-aggressor in the Russian war against Ukraine. Second, the international community should demand the withdrawal of Russian troops from Belarus, because the more they're there, the more Ukraine is threatened. We need an international tribunal and other accountability mechanisms to be launched against the regime for the crime of aggression and war crimes in Ukraine. And in the same way as it happened with Putin, the International Criminal Court should follow up and issue a warrant to arrest Lukashenko and his circle, because Lukashenko is also has also committed the crime, war crimes in Ukraine. And we need to think about the role of Belarus in the post-war security architecture of the region. Democratic Belarus should break the military and political alliance with Russia. So this is important. My third, I'm just checking the time. So let's also focus on the internal situation and repression. In 2020, Putin supported Lukashenko as his key political ally. And despite the sort of mutual animosity and conflicts they had before, both of them hate democracy and hate human rights and freedom. And their only goal is to keep power. So that was, I think, not surprising that Lukashenko now clings to Russia as the source of his security and financing, sponsoring of his role. But what's important here is that Lukashenko's desire to remain a Russian satellite goes against the will of the majority of Belarusians. Lisa already mentioned the moods in the Belarusian society, but what's important here is this strong anti-war sentiment among Belarusians. But of course, any public demonstration of opposition toward war is criminally prosecuted. We can argue a lot about whether we should trust polls in wartime and under a dictatorship, but I think what is clear, if we look at the polls of the Chatham House and other organizations, is the existence of a national consensus among Belarusians. And this is the unwillingness of the overwhelming majority of Belarusians to participate in the war against Ukraine. Both phone and internet online surveys showed that between 86 and 97% of respondents, of people, are against the deployment of Belarusian troops to Ukraine. And by the way, regarding nuclear weapons, that was also quite similar. Last year's surveys of the Chatham House showed that some 80% of Belarusians are against the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. And these surveys were conducted like 4 months, right? So that the result was quite consistent. When it comes to the internal situation, the repression only escalated since 2020, but also especially 2022. At least 17 people are arrested daily in Belarus. The last month, there was this regime's information that the police identified 700 people with radical views, which means that these people are against the regime. So imagine 700 people arrested in just 1 month. So that's a really huge number that shows us that, well, people did not give up and the opposition did not decrease in Belarus despite state terror and despite people not being able to protest. What I think is important also to consider here is the UN High Commissioner's Office and the latest report that amounted some crimes, human rights violations in Belarus to crimes against humanity. So this is the international crime, and the situation is really serious and we can't ignore it, and the regime should be punished for that. There are currently more than 1,500 recognized political prisoners in Belarus, and the number is only growing. We have a Nobel Peace Prize winner in jail, and basically, like the whole Belarus is in jail, right? All different social, professional, age, gender groups are in prisons right now. So first, one of the priorities that should be that I should indicate for the international community is focusing on political prisoners in Belarus and paying attention to that issue. And in general, just to sort of sum up the strategy, how we should look at that. So first of all, it should be pressure, support, and justice. And that would be, I think, the easiest way to describe it. Pressure, these are sanctions that I also mentioned previously, and Western sanctions must only be strengthened. There is recently some discussion in the EU regarding potash and whether sanctions on potash should be lifted or softened. So this cannot happen. What we need right now, of course, strengthening sanctions, but also monitoring sanction enforcement. In the EU, we don't have such a body as OFAC in the US that watch the enforcement of sanctions. So this is something we should consider. And of course, there are different areas where we can look, like rail transit, SWIFT, personal sanctions, and so on. When it comes to justice, that's another really important area. I already mentioned the International Tribunal, and also this sort of punishment for crimes against humanity. And here I would like to commend the work of the International Accountability Platform and the examination team under the Office of High Commissioner, who monitor, observe, collect evidence of violations of human rights in Belarus, and at least 17,000 pieces of evidence have already been collected. So now we need to put it sort of to the next step and start investigations and looking into that. Support is really important, and I know that we will discuss it later, but now it's even more important than before, if I can put it this way, because of national identity and being destroyed basically right now by Lukashenko, and Russia is becoming here more influential, unfortunately. And of course, propaganda is prevalent in Belarus because of media blackout. So here, another area where we should focus. Of course, it's really important to distinguish between people and the regime, and delegitimize regime in the same way as the Council of Europe did, by stopping collaborating with the Belarusian government and instead collaborating with civil society and democratic forces. And I think what's even more important, and I'm going to stop right now, but is to make Belarus a priority, because we see that whatever happens in Belarus then affects the region and eventually the world. So this should not be the last issue to solve, because there are now more important issues, but to understand this real priority of that country and focus on the solution of the internal political and human rights crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. And I think it sounded like already recommendations that should be very good for the end of discussion. But we still have one very important piece of our meeting today, and this is the further discussion of all those aspects that you already mentioned, actually. Be it military threats, be it political stability, be it civil society or responsibility. And that's why I would like to offer you all to switch now to our distinguished panel. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it doesn't really matter where we all come from if we have one goal in mind and one thing to talk about. And but this time really it matters that we all come from this region that is very close to Belarus, and but still I think that many countries might have different aspects, feelings, or opinions or perspectives about Belarus from their own perspective. And in this case, we're represented by Lithuania, Denmark, Poland, and also Latvia. And as usually in some big sports competitions, we would like to say, representing Poland in red corner, no, sorry, for red corner, probably, I don't know, white corner. That would be representing Poland, Weronika Lapucka, who is currently PhD candidate at the Graduate School for Social Research Institute of Philosophy and Sociology in Polish Academy of Sciences, and also a co-founder of E-Center in Warsaw. And Ms. Lapucka consults with various international or regional organizations and funds on media and democratization in Central Eastern Europe and post-Soviet countries. We also have representing Denmark from other corner of our discussion ring is Klaus Mathiasen, who is a senior lecturer at the Danish Royal Defense Academy. And his specialties include Ukraine, military affairs, also military developments after the collapse of Soviet Union, and different relations between Russia, US, NATO, and as well as culture and history. Representing Lithuania, Tomas Janeliūnas, professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Sciences at Vilnius University. Hopefully will join us in this discussion, Jakob Tolstrup, also associate professor at the Aarhus University, also from Denmark. And last but not least, Sigita Struberg, who is the Secretary General of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. And she's also a lecturer at Latvian University. And her latest academic publications focus on public perception of security and strategic communication, and also the influence of Russia and China in Latvia and Europe. And as you can see, each of our experts have their own speciality, own expertise in their sphere. So I will give each of you 5-7 minutes, probably. I hope that you will be as precise as Hannah was, but I will not be so strict. But you will have 5-7 minutes for your presentations, and after that we will switch to Q&A session, followed also by conclusions and recommendations. So as it was mentioned before, Ukraine is actually on the center of political discourse for more than a year, and that is why I would like to ask my first questions to Klaus Mathiasen. And this choice is very logical because this war is going on for more than 400 days, and attacks from Belarus and still Belarus giving ground for Russian troops. These are all factors that actually influence the outcome of the war, despite the official fact that Belarus is not officially in work with Ukraine, but de facto it is. And sometimes I have a feeling that during this war, we are really not talking about Belarus as independent country anymore, but as a marionette of Russia. Klaus, what would be your take on the military and security developments in our region?
Thank you. I'll just say a few words about that because many things have already been mentioned, and I think if we would like to have time for recommendations and discussions, I'll do it very shortly. I will start by saying that of all the countries in the Union, Belarus has the closest relations with Russia. At least formally, and maybe also in other aspects. I'll leave that to other participants to evaluate that. But you all probably remember that Belarus was a co-founder of CIS in December 1991, and Belarus has been a member of the Collective Security Treaty since December 93, and the renewed and Collective Security Treaty Organization since it was established in 2003. And Belarus has been in the closest cooperation with Russia in the framework of the Union State since 96-98, although it should be mentioned that for many years this cooperation was without very substantial content. Since 2001, Belarus has been member of the Eurasian Economic Cooperation, and since 2015, Belarus has been member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has existed for a couple of decades, has Belarus as an observer since 2015. So you can see there are very many formal relations between Russia and Belarus. I agree that what the former speaker said, that before 2019, Lukashenko attempted to conduct, at least to some degree, an independent foreign policy. Belarus invited China to make investments in Belarusian infrastructure, and it was intended, as I understand it, to keep the level of cooperation in the framework of the Union State as low as possible. And as it was also mentioned, Belarus offered itself as a mediator in different conflicts, including the conflict in Donbass. But as a matter of fact, in the framework of the Union State, a joint military doctrine with Russia and Belarus has existed since 2001. And it was a new edition of this common military doctrine was approved in November 2019. It was stated in this document that many threats to the Union State, there are now many more threats to the Union State than there were back in 2001. It was referred to the tense situation in Ukraine, especially since 2014, the enhanced presence of NATO forces at the borders of the Union State, and the means of hybrid warfare, including sanctions, which were used against the Union State, that is Russia and Belarus. It was stated that there should be common reactions to threats. That is, it was agreed to develop a regional force structure. It was agreed to allow joint use of infrastructure, and it was also agreed that there should be a joint reaction in case of an attack on the Union State, a kind of let's say, NATO-like agreement between two countries. I also agree that the presidential elections in 2020 anyway changed the real situation very much. You can say, as you said earlier, that Putin saved Lukashenko's life as head of Belarus, at least. The opposition was suppressed and partly forced to leave Belarus. Since then, we have seen an increased Russian pressure to realize the possibilities included in the Union State framework, and this includes also military questions where the ties have been really strengthened since then. There have been exercises of the Union State reaction forces back in February 2022, just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It made Belarus part of the conflict. As a matter of fact, that Belarusian territory was used for the invasion. Belarusian airspace and territory continue to be used by Russia's armed forces. Belarus provides supplies, ammunition, and equipment. Belarus provides training of mobilized Russian personnel and units. More seriously, Russia has today probably more than 10,000 troops stationed in Belarus, probably on a more or less permanent basis. And the latest development, which has been mentioned, the announcement of building storage facilities for tactical nuclear ammunition in Belarus, and providing of means of delivery, Iskander, training of pilots of combat aircraft, and so on. These are all things which are now a reality. And on this background, I will say that it's really difficult to see how Belarus, under these circumstances, can distance or eventually liberate itself from Russia. And based on the actual situation, I would say that this can only happen in case of a full collapse and change of regime in Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. So that was very good insights. And I should say to all the participants that our colleague Jakob Tolstrup has sent his apologizes that he will not be able to participate in today's discussions due to personal circumstances, and I hope that his daughter will get better soon. But we will continue our conversation, and even if those security and defense issues are sometimes the most worrying for an average person, average citizen of the neighboring countries, we cannot forget also the political field, because actually right now we have very interesting and probably even unique situation, because there are two more or less aggressive countries in our close neighborhood with whom we have either limited or almost no diplomatic relations. That is, of course, Russia and Belarus. And this is why I would like to ask Professor Tomas Janeliūnas from Lithuania to focus probably his presentation on the impact of this societal and political developments in Belarus and in the neighboring region on the Nordic-Baltic politicity.
Yes, thank you, Ugis. You are right. The situation is unique indeed, and it has quite a major impact on what is going on the political level in the neighboring countries as well. We don't have much time, so I will jump right into the Lithuanian context and perspective regarding Belarus. And I would start with a notion that for many years in Lithuania persisted a view that Belarus is a kind of hostage of Putin's Russia. And therefore, we must do whatever is possible to detach Belarus from Russia. For example, Lithuanian foreign policymakers employed different tactics, but for the most time, Belarusian society was regarded separately from Lukashenko's regime and Russian society, of course. However, it seems that this attitude is changing now, and this is quite important tendency, quite important trend. In Lithuania, at least on the political level, the position that Russian and Belarusian society are responsible for the actions of regimes is becoming more dominant. It is based on the same presumption that we should not separate Putin's regime from Russian society. And with some nuances, the same notion more and more is applied to Belarusian society as well. Just for example, just recently, a new law establishing restrictive measures on Russia's and Belarus citizens was drafted in Lithuania. And among other measures, there are provisions included to suspend issuing visas to Russian and Belarusian citizens, suspending permits of residential status, and suspending Russian citizens from acquiring real estate and applying for Lithuanian citizenship. In the first draft, restrictions were intended to apply both to Russian and Belarusian citizens. Only after discussions in the Parliament Committee some restrictions for Belarus citizens were excluded, for example, from buying real estate or getting residence permits. However, I would say that the tendency is quite clear to treat Belarus and Russian citizens as a potential threat to Lithuanian national security and to restrict some economic and political activities for them. Actually, this draft ignited a lot of discussions in Lithuania, and in the final version of the law, some separation between Russian and Belarusian citizens was established. But in my opinion, this kind of mixing of Russian citizens and Belarusian migrants are quite worrisome. Last year, the Eastern Europe Study Center researched the situation of Belarus migrants in Lithuania, and we have more than 40,000 Belarusian citizens in Lithuania right now. According to this survey, most respondents, it's 86% of them, left Belarus for political reasons and due to a feeling of deep insecurity about staying in their home country. So though those migrants are not supporters of Lukashenko's regime at all. As for reasons for choosing Lithuania as the host country, about half of the respondents mentioned the possibility of obtaining documents for legalization. But it seems that that may not be the case anymore if more and more restrictions on Belarusians are introduced. I think this kind of trend is quite bad one. Just trying to speak about Russian society and Belarusians as the same group, and to treat them also in the same conditions. Also, just a small remark regarding the announcement that tactical nuclear weapons can be deployed in Belarus. It is taken in Lithuania, of course, as another signal that Lukashenko's regime is subjugated to the military goals of Moscow. However, in practical terms, I think tactical nukes in Belarus do not change anything. We have Kaliningrad by our side with a much higher concentration of military units, including Iskander missiles that can be equipped with nuclear warheads as well. But in the political sense, Lukashenko's regime becomes less and less independent when choosing options of how to engage or disengage in a potential conflict with NATO, as colleagues who spoke just before me also mentioned. In my view, tactical nuclear weapon has no military value at all, but as propaganda tool or instrument of psychological pressure, of course, it can play a role. And such an announcement contributes to more extensive anxiety inside the society, at least in Lithuania, as we can feel as much. Which is also, the society is very sensitive to any mentioning of a nuclear thing of any kind. So this kind of Lukashenko's and Putin's engagement in nuclear tension, of course, it has a meaning. It has, first of all, this psychological and propagandic meaning. As I guess Hannah mentioned it already, it is, of course, a sign that Putin has used almost all other instruments trying to stop Western support for Ukrainian armament, but it didn't succeed. So this a new stage of increasing tension using this nuclear blackmailing. Of course, this is just another attempt to get back on the stage, just threatening Western societies, first of all, not military planners or political elites, but societies, I think. And this is, of course, contributes to some pressure on the society. And society, of course, as a reaction, they also express some anxiety not only to their regimes, Putin's or Lukashenko's regimes, but to Russian and Belarusian society as well. So this is, as I said, is quite a worrisome trend. I can feel right now, at least in Lithuania. I will stop here, and I will give the floor for other contributors.
Thank you for your insights, and I think you mentioned very good thing that every time in Russia somebody speaks about nuclear weapons, West goes a bit crazy. I have this feeling, and this is like a red I don't know, red thing for a bull, and then everybody starts to freak out in some way. But you already also mentioned one thing, that this is mainly used as a propaganda tool and tool to influence. And in 2010, when I personally started to follow events in Belarus, not Lithuania, but Poland was actually regarded as a safe haven for many Belarusian journalists who flee there and started to provide information to probably to counter this state propaganda in Belarus. And if we remember and still remember, for example, Belsat, which is one of the most prominent independent media for Belarusian society. And this is why I would like to switch to Veronika Laputska. And at the moment, she's involved in writing of two book projects with Professor David Marples of University of Alberta in Canada. One on the politics of memory of the places of mass extermination in Belarus in 30s and 40s, and another on 2020 Belarusian protests. And her research interests and expertise include media, and also visual and Jewish studies, as well as study of nationalism and politics of memory. And that is why I would like to ask Veronika to give her insights about the importance of information and developing this resilience against the propaganda of state machinery from Belarus and also Russian side in this moment. Veronika?
Thank you very much, Ugis, for these great questions. I think that it's very important that we speak about information and media, because indeed information, social media, and media were basically the decisive factors in 2020 events, in line with some other, of course, things which happened, like COVID-19 pandemic and the change of political leadership. But in the end, internet technologies and also media played a crucial role. And of course, regime realized that, and that is why we see so many repressions happening against the media. So in my speech, I would focus on the media per se. I will speak about also propaganda, how it kind of evolutionized since 2020 in Belarus, and also I'll speak about societal resistance. So what is happening in civil society of Belarus inside and also outside, as you rightly mentioned, Ugis. There are many centers now of Belarusian grassroots initiatives, political dissidents, and media. Mainly they're now in Vilnius, in Warsaw. Before the war in Ukraine, Kyiv was also one of such places. But I think that it's important to start my kind of speech with the answer to our overall discussion, because we're trying to analyze and to see whether Belarus is an occupied country. So Elizaveta already said that there is a hybrid occupation, and then Thomas said about occupation by Russia in a way in Belarus. And I would like to say that that is why I agree with my colleagues, and also I think overall that what we have in Belarus, it's kind of a double occupation, because Belarus is not only occupied in military terms and foreign politics terms by Russia, right? But because we have military troops there, and Lukashenko is dependent 100% on, although some experts argue about this, but he's very dependent on Putin and what is happening in the Kremlin. But also we have an occupation which is diverted against the Belarusian citizens by the regime itself. So Belarusians kind of found themselves in this really complicated double occupation on two levels, external and internal. And of course, it influences what I'm going to say now. So when we speak about media, of course, we know that most of the media just went completely underground in Belarus. Those who remain, they're extremely brave, I would say, and they face everyday risk of being detained and tortured and repressed. 34 representatives of media are now in jail. One of them is Andrzej Poczobut, who is Polish, and of course, the release of Andrzej Poczobut is extremely important for Poland, where I'm talking to you from, and Polish foreign policy. This is one of the important factors why, for instance, at this point, it's really complicated for Belarusians to cross the Belarusian-Polish border. And there are other consequences which are really felt on very kind of basic societal level by Belarusians and by Poles because of this. I would like also to say that most of the media who kind of are open about what they do, they of course had to move. And once again, they mainly operate from either Vilnius or Warsaw or Tbilisi now. So now it's another kind of important center. And of course, so thanks to against technology and the inventiveness and also hard work and their bravery, they still operate. And we have to give them a credit that still media in Belarus, they remain important not only for outer world, but also for Belarusians inside, who are very much isolated in terms of information, and they don't sometimes know what is happening except for Telegram channels and except for some independent media whom they can visit using VPN or some other techniques, how to kind of avoid this blackout, which Hannah was speaking about. So propaganda in Belarus, because using this isolation, and this is my second thing I want to mention, which is very important, it really deteriorated. I would now say, and I've been doing many projects in propaganda disinformation in the region, that it became even worse than in Russia. What we see, what is happening on when people like Grigory Azaronak are speaking, or some other TV anchors on ONT or Belarus One channels, it's completely obnoxious, humiliating, and I would say in any other country they would already be facing quite serious sentences in the trials. But of course, it's not happening in Belarus. The way they speak about the enemies of the regime is completely pathetic, and this will continue because once again, media in Belarus, I mean, those media who support the regime, they have no other choice how to operate. But in terms of quality, they of course on much lower level than independent media. So the only way they can kind of deal and attract audience and also attract views on social media on platforms such as YouTube is being that aggressive, using this kind of rhetoric, which would kind of make people just watch them for this reason. And unfortunately, some people did change their points of view since 2020, but I would say if we look into, once again, polls, which might be not 100% now trustworthy if we speak about independent polls, because it's hard to operate and how to deliver them. Still, Belarusians kind of don't really believe in this propaganda. unlike Russia's society, right? Russia's society much more believe in the propaganda they're saying about war in Ukraine, about what is happening in the region, about this conspiracy that the NATO want to, you know, spread their power to the east and conquer Belarus and Russia. Belarusians do not really believe in this on a mass scale, but propaganda still uses these arguments, and this is what we should kind of remember, that as long as the regime uses this type of narratives, we should understand that this is what they have in their mind and how they treat Western partners and democratic world. So we shouldn't be naive about what is happening, and they will continue doing this as long as they are allies with Russia. And speaking about the third component I wanted to focus is resistance by the society. Of course, that there are many centers, as I've mentioned, outside the country. And there are multiple initiatives which were brought and reopened sometimes by active Belarusians in Vilnius, in Warsaw, in Tbilisi, in Berlin, in the United States, really all over the places. And Belarusians are, for the first time, I would say, in the contemporary history, when we speak about diasporas, that they still remain very much attached to each other after 2020 events and supportive. And this is this very interesting process of kind of re-emergence of Belarusian identity, which still remains quite strong even outside the country. Another important force which we haven't spoken about is, of course, the military force, and we speak about Kalinovsky Regiment, who fight on the territory of Ukraine with Russians. And also, if we will look into sociological polls, they are quite actually popular and quite trustworthy. And sometimes they even compete in terms of trust, public trust, with the Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and United Democratic Forces. So this is also something new and something interesting, which has never happened before. Again, when we speak about what is happening inside Belarus, not only media, not only NGOs, they remain active as much as they can, but also Belarusian citizens, right? We should not forget about all those people who still risk their lives and freedom. One of their kind of last repression waves were directed at, first of all, people who performed partisan activities in Machulishchy, near Minsk, when their A-50 plane was destroyed. And we know now that about 30 people are detained following this criminal case, and unfortunately they might be facing even death penalty because the prosecutor general changed the accusation into terror by the group of people, and this is now the punishment in the Belarusian criminal code they can face. And another thing which I think it's important to mention is that it's incredibly important that international organizations continue to follow all these repressions and all these problems which are happening in Belarus, and they continue to register these tortures and violations of the human rights. And I want to also bring something we haven't mentioned before, that recently another Moscow mechanism was launched by OCODIR. So the first one happened in autumn, in October 2020, now it's another one. So it's going to be another report. And I think it's also important because OC remains the only organization, if we speak about Europe, where Russia is still part of it. So they don't only have this Moscow mechanism launched for Belarus, but also for Ukraine. And I think it's important that this focus on Belarus remains, and that we continue to follow all the like very, I would say, grave manipulations and events which are happening in Belarus. I think that in the end we can discuss what can be done, what else can be done. But in the moment, this is all from my side, and I will pass the floor to my other colleagues. Thank you very much, Guys.
Thank you, Veronica, for your commentary. And you already mentioned the importance of different international organizations, and that is why I will give floor to the last but not the least of our participants, Sigitas Struberga, who is representing the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. And as your position already suggests, that the situation in Belarus has also a wider European and transatlantic perspective or layer. And in fact, I find it very tricky because from one side, international organizations right now play a huge role in supporting civil society in Belarus. However, during the time of war, somehow civil society is, especially in the country which we can call a second aggressor, might not be a priority, and the priority right now is to end the war as soon as possible. Sigita, I would like to hear your perspective now.
Indeed, Udis, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. There is certain feeling that, of course, in the context of war, the winning in the war has become priority, and many issues have become silent in a way. And on another hand, still we can definitely say that transatlantic community and the European Union in particular plays a crucial role in support of Belarusian people. There is no doubt on that, as well as there is no doubt on the role of EU in regards of attempts to somehow limit the opportunities of manipulations or further successful existence of Lukashenko's regime. At the same time, these options are limited, as well as opportunities to prevent the regime from kind of partial or full integration with Russia. And this is evidenced by several significant recent processes. Some of them previous speakers already mentioned, but also we can remind not only nukes issue or some other which were mentioned, but also, for example, the integration of tax system, which is proposed, and many others. But if we return to nukes issue, definitely this announcement, I would say, as for me, was clear demonstration of who is the master in this situation in certain way, because we remember in which day Putin did this announcement, how important this day is for Belarusians. But at the same time, I do agree with previous speakers that from security perspective, this does not change much. And why I'm mentioning this, because I would say that this announcement of placement of nuclear weapons or this kind of threatening with nukes is one of many Russian activities at the moment, which show us that we can't really use rationality at the core of analysis or forecast. Future course of actions in Russia is unlikely based on strict cost and benefits analysis or other rational choices. And even for when we see what Lukashenko is doing, we can speak about limited rationality. And this is in a way bad news for Belarus or Belarusian people, because Belarus might be drawn further into war, and this might result in, let's say, unexpected and uncontrollable results. By the way, some researchers say that it can be also turned into good news, since maybe some protests might start, but I'm not that optimistic, unfortunately. So what the international community or West is doing, in particular what the EU is doing, and what can do better, the first and the foremost, of course, is important to maintain the unity. And I would say that there is a need to implement even more value-oriented foreign policy and trade policy. We see the example of Baltic states and Poland already, but on another hand, we also heard already today that Lithuania, who is champion in supporting Belarusians, in Lithuania, this support is decreasing. And this is really kind of warn for all the Europe that there is a need to work with this issue. And although financial and trade sanctions have added certain pressure on regime and added certain difficulties for import and export, and indeed the regime already faces significant obstacles, and then also certain kind of not only financial but moral also pressure. I would say that it's not sufficient, and in this sense, although, as it was mentioned, Brussels has warned Belarus on new sanctions. At the same time, European Union has not included Belarus in its last 3 sanction packages, despite the promises to do so. And from my perspective, there is a need to increase pressure on Lukashenko's regime in this manner. And also, I would say that beside that, what has not been done sufficiently is the calculation of Lukashenko's cooperation with Russia regarding replacement of trade. So indeed, I really see that there is still work to do. The second point, which I wanted to mention, is that, of course, it was mentioned a lot today, but I would like to repeat that, of course, EU plays a crucial, or European countries play a crucial role in supporting Belarusians in exile. But also today was mentioned that this support probably is not sufficient. And in this sense, I would like to mention several layers of Belarusian diaspora in abroad, starting from diaspora in general, up to media, NGOs, which were mentioned by Veronica, and of course opposition, which was mentioned also several times today. And the 3 later ones, of course, they need special support mechanisms. When it comes to diaspora in general, as it was reported in regards of Lithuania already, but also other kind of researchers have demonstrated that basically Belarusian political refugees face high rates of denial of their applications for asylum. For example, in Sweden, only 2% of Belarusian applications have positive responses. And if the role leaders are also about giving up their position, then situation in Sweden and other countries can even worsen. And also, this refugees face other challenges related to their individual and work status in Europe. For example, inability to open bank accounts, refusals to rent, etc. Regarding media and NGOs, there is a need to help to take care of their legal status, need to provide expert support for empowerment of media and NGOs in exile, as well as the need to provide the various platforms for expressing their opinions and to provide ground for to maintain continuity of their work, which I find really important. And I really think that in this sense, we haven't paid sufficient attention to this. And in regards of opposition, taking in account challenges it faces, there is a need to continue to provide financial and expert assistance, as well as diplomatic one. And this diplomatic one, I think it's if we hear quite a lot about need for financial support, maybe some expert support, then I think less often we hear about this need for diplomatic support. There are certain cases when the platform for speaking is given, and maybe there is certain self-satisfaction that we have done enough. But on another hand, I think there are several examples when we see that the support is not enough. Like, for example, I think that Europe can do more on building the bridges between, let's say, Kiev and Belarusian opposition. We have observed that Kiev, in a way, sees Lukashenko as certain guarantor of stability. And that's why we haven't really heard that Kiev has been very sharp and kind of criticizing Lukashenko. And if Lukashenko is seen in Europe as a clear threat and then supporter in Russia's war, then with Kiev it's a bit different. At least I have this feeling, and for this reason, exactly here, this is one of the examples where Europe should work more on diplomatic support to the Belarusian opposition. And then the final point on supporting Belarusians, I would say that there is a need for more support to release of political prisoners. It was a bit mentioned here today, but indeed I would like to underline it once more, because there is definitely certain need to make more pressure on Lukashenko's regime for release of political prisoners. And another point which we can observe is that although, of course, there is support in Europe for relocation of Belarusian businesses, still I think more can be done. And in this sense, I remember quite well the discussion on this issue in Latvia. So at first phase, everyone was so optimistic that we will do this and that, and we will get more support for Belarusian businesses here in Latvia. But it resulted to the situation that we were not, our system was not that friendly that so many IT companies would come over to work here as we hoped they would do. At the same time, we can remember about statistics which were given from Belarus in 2021, when the research demonstrated that around 60% of Belarusian companies would like to move abroad. And I believe that this demonstrates how much we still can do on that. So some researchers are still discussing the issue of Eastern Partnership as one of the mechanisms for support of Belarusian people. At least the issue is to hold this as in agenda. In this sense, I would, and please criticize me if I'm wrong, but I really don't see it as effective tool. Since I have not feeling that Europe itself believes in Eastern Partnership as such. Besides, we have seen how much this Eastern Partnership has been criticized by Georgians and Ukrainians, and I don't see that it has kind of long-term future in Europe. Also, what I would like to mention here in regards of Eastern Partnership program as such is that if we try to remind 2020, then the popular protests in Belarus were not really about integration in Europe. They were about freedom from Lukashenko's regime. And in this sense, I'm afraid that in certain moment we can be again in the trap of wishful thinking, in which West is quite often facing itself, while considering what other societies or what other members of societies want. And that's why I would be really careful with that. And also other researchers list the importance of transatlantic community to support Belarusian volunteers who are fighting in Ukraine, or to support of partisans in Belarus. But I really don't see, if we criticize transatlantic community for non-sufficient support for this, I really don't see what means EU or NATO have in this sense. I would rather say that we risk, first of all, I don't think that it's important instrument and I think we risk to get in other type of traps by supporting this program. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigita. You reminded me of my personal sympathies to European Eastern Partnership program for years, and I still have this feeling that even if it's considered dead, it still has some future for it. But I think that's like all the integration processes in Europe, they are made to not integrate, but to keep them in a long distance. In a distance of arm away from Europe, but if somebody gets closer, then we start to think what to do with that. But you raised the question, and I think we have finished our main introductory speaks. I would like to continue to integrate the questions we have received in the further discussion. I think we could allow some 20 minutes for these discussions. And Sigita, you already mentioned that there is a need and wish to cooperate with opposition forces. And one of the questions here is, but whom do we work with and whom do we support? And there are so many fractions of opposition, and that they have different levels of support from population. And as it was mentioned also before, that's actually those fractions, they are themselves fighting for recognition and for support of people. And I usually like to be provocative. And if we know that, for example, in Poland, everybody calls Tikhanovskaya president-elect. But if we consider that elections were not valid, then and Lukashenko is not a valid person, that how can she be regarded as elected president? I think that there is a controversy, and my suggestion personal would be for European countries to come to one conclusion, how we call her at least. But I would like to ask you, Sigita, first, and then probably also Veronica and Hanna to comment on that. Who should we talk to, and how should we support those opposition forces, and what could be those inputs that could probably make some changes? Sigita, starting with you.
Yeah, thank you, Udis, for the question. Indeed, what we are facing, even our organization, while working and cooperating with Belarusian opposition, indeed, is the fact that there are those fractions which are competing between themselves, and it does not help us. And we also have seen from other examples that fragmented opposition and this kind of competition actually is if I may say, shooting in the leg of opposition itself. Since then there are those questions with whom to work and how to work, how to make everyone satisfied at the end of the day. That's why indeed this is painful question, and I think that Belarusians have to find the solution for this themselves. How to unite around the one aim. But when it comes to our homeworks, what we can do, as I said before, I really think that there is a need for more diplomatic support, and I mentioned case of Ukraine in particular, or relations between Belarusian opposition and Kiev. Also, I would say that we should work with all those who are trustful, and there should be not only diplomatic support but also expert support to empower opposition, expert support to give various platforms, like for example this discussion. Maybe there can be far more discussions, and in this sense I am really thankful to Latvian Institute of Foreign Affairs of leading these discussions in Latvia, since at least then we hear voice of Belarusians hear more. So yeah, and then the platforms, expertise, and diplomatic support are those which I would like to mention as mechanisms for support.
I think that yeah, I will give a word now to Klaus, who is leaving us, but please, can you have some comment, Klaus?
Yes. Once again, what was the question?
Oh, there is one other question about security issues. That we were talking about nuclear weapons and threats, but it was also mentioned that for years the weapons have been stationed in Kaliningrad region.
Exactly.
And how this decision about nuclear arsenal in Belarus will impact Russian-Belarus relations and the security situation in the region as a whole now? Has it changed dramatically now?
No, I don't think so. I just answered the question in the chat that I agree that it doesn't affect the regional security situation very much. Of course, it has some significance, but anyway, it's not a dramatic change because there are tactical nuclear weapon storage in the Kaliningrad region already. But I agree that it will, of course, tie Belarus even closer to Russia. I don't think that Belarus will be in charge of these weapons. They will be controlled by Russia, just as the American tactical nuclear weapon, which is located in 4 or 5 countries in Europe, are under strictly American control. So I agree it will not change that very much. It is of importance looking at the possibilities for Belarus to move away from Russia. And as I said already during my presentation, I find it very, very difficult in this moment without a major change in Russia.
And to follow up, the other question would be, how could you comment the last aggressive statements by Lukashenko during the meeting with the Minister of Defense of Russia, Shoigu, that Minsk requires security guarantees in case if Belarus is attacked, the same like in NATO? Do you think that it's...
Well, I think these guarantees are already there. Because in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, there is an Article 4, which is very similar to Article 5 in the NATO Pact. And it says that if one country is attacked, it should be considered as an attack on the whole alliance. And this is more or less repeated in the Union State military doctrine. So I think that it's just rhetorics.
Thank you, Klaus, and I really appreciate your involvement in our discussion, and we will continue. And thank you
Please.
for being a part of this project.
Thank you, and all the best to all of you.
So we will continue our discussion with the question we started before with Sigita. I will forward it to Veronica and later also to Hanna about what is your opinion about the involvement of Belarusian opposition forces, or as they like to be called, democratic forces. Who should be those contact persons? So should we choose one, or should we pay our attention to different regions or different areas? Probably, Veronica, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Ugis. I would like to follow up with what Klaus has just said, and actually to also refer a little bit to this question by Shota Gvinere, because when we speak about regional security, let's not forget about security for Belarusians themselves. How do they feel about having a nuclear weapon on their territory, especially after the trauma of Chernobyl disaster, which is extremely embedded in every Belarusian family, in everyone, and it's still part of like trauma. And also, of course, it affects even such things as people still choose certain food from certain regions only. So they do have this trauma, and I do think that we also have to think: has anyone asked Belarusians how do they feel about this? We had a referendum 3 days after the war in Ukraine started. Everybody knows it was falsified because this point was returned to the constitution that Belarus is not a neutral and not nuclear country anymore after these changes. So it was completely changed by the regime. So let's not forget about this. Let's not just think about regional security. This is one thing. And also speaking about the treaty of what is collective security treaty, right, organization, when there were conflicts between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Did other countries really support Armenia? I wouldn't say so. Maybe Russia, right? So we all know that this organization is not, in terms of their legal kind of how to say this requirements, whether they stick to what is written in their treaty. It's not like in case of the NATO. So this is very different. We can't compare this. And speaking about democratic representation. And I think about nukes, Hanna will speak more because she wrote a brilliant piece just a few days ago about this. And speaking about representation, I think that once again, in effect, Belarusians decided themselves who is their representative, because in parallel with their elections, which were almost always falsified and didn't happen in line with international standards provided by Venice Commission and other international standards. There were different campaigns, right, run by Golos, but also by Zubr, like initiatives where people actually calculated alternatively how many people voted for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And it was legitimate, it was kind of verified by international partners. So to a certain extent, it did show that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was elected. So when we speak about representation, I think of Belarusians, in the majority, they decided like this, it should be this way. But also, I don't think it's a problem. I'm very happy also that I want to thank Sigita. The Sigita brought up a lot of problematic issues Belarusians are having abroad with asylum, with refugee documents, but also, you know, we all speak about all these different groups of Belarusians whom to speak to. Of course, it's always easier to have one partner, but I think it's also a feature of a democratic community when there are different forces represented different points of view. It's absolutely normal. So I don't think that we should be afraid of this. This is absolutely natural. And this is what's going to happen when the regime will change. It's like there will be a lot of forces. So I think that the West shouldn't be terrified by the fact that there are different political forces and political views. It's natural, it's actually good, it's a feature of democracy. But in terms of whom to speak to now at the moment, at least until 2024, we have a president-elect. And I think it's normal to kind of speak to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her representation. Hanna, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just add to Veronica's brilliant answer that I think that the democratic forces of Belarus, we don't really call them opposition because we like people consider themselves the majority, not the opposition, or this kind of small fraction of those who voted for Lukashenko. That's why this division, right? So the democratic forces is like opposition in your countries, right? So you do not always agree with them. I think countries in the EU do not always agree among each other either. So I think it's just normal that that there are some different views, right? Whether on sanctions, on how support should look like, and how negotiations might look like, and so on. So this is normal. This is just the beginning, right? The beginning of the discussion that we are sort of all involved in. And the farther away we are from victory, the more conflicts might appear, but this does not mean that we are not united. And let's look at practical examples. In February 2020, when there was this sham fake referendum scheduled by Lukashenko 3 days after the full-scale invasion began, all the democratic forces, at least the representative of the major groups, gathered in Vilnius. That was because of the referendum, and then because of the war, the agenda actually changed immediately, and all the attention, all the future strategy steps and so on were changed immediately during that very first day of the full-scale invasion. Then in August 2022, the United Transition Cabinet was launched by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and it represents, again, the representatives of major forces, organizations of the democratic forces. We also have the Coordination Council, which represents the people of Belarus, and that was agreed or mentioned at least in the resolution of the EU and also in the US, and it basically represents more than 100 civil society organizations and individuals. So there are, I think, initiatives. There are names, and Veronica mentioned Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She ran in the election. She was a registered candidate, and she has this legitimacy, right, to represent the people of Belarus. But what's important is also the legitimization of Alexander Lukashenko, because the democratic world did not recognize the election results in 2020. And what's next? What have we done? What are we going to do with that? I mentioned the example of the Council of Europe. What else can be done? How else can we sort of kick out Lukashenko of those international organizations, right? Why is he present there? Why his decisions are being considered legal, legitimate, and so on? This is not how it should be done. And I think another, if we look into the future, right, the main idea of the female trio of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the two other women was to bring new free and fair election. And this is something that we should keep in mind. That's why people voted for her, for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, because she promised that. And she needs to fulfill this promise, right? And that's something that we need to strive and sort of aspire to achieve. And this is something that we spoke a little bit about the Eastern Partnership project and the fact that the revolution in 2020 was not geopolitical. Yes, this is true, but it does not mean that the EU cannot help the democratic forces, civil society of Belarus develop the vision of a free and democratic Belarus, help with reforms, and sort of show the opportunities and show the prospects of Belarus being in the European family. So this is now important. This is now, the fight for minds that we are now involved in. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
And my final question will go to Thomas, because Lithuania is actually the only country who has recognized the Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as elected president. If I'm not correct, correct me if I'm wrong. But I will follow it with a question we have received, that the notion of making distinction between the people and the regime proved to be difficult to implement for the Western bureaucracy. Being in a responsive mode to the malign actions of Russia and their proxies have strengthened and entrenched autocracies in Belarus and Georgia. In other words, only sanctioning without positive agenda have been counterproductive. What can the West do to really help and strengthen pro-democracy stakeholders? Thomas, I would give you this chance to finish our discussion, and then I will give the floor to Lisa about the conclusions.
Thank you, Ugis, and thank you for the question. Of course, there's a lot of tension. What practical means the Western countries could provide for the democratic forces of Belarus. But I would not agree that sanctions is not enough. Sanctions, of course, as a legal act is just one step. Enforcing of sanctions, that is one of the most urgent tasks, I would say, because even in Lithuania, we every week found something new, how those sanctions are trying to overpass, and to say how, what kind of possibilities still exist to overpass those sanctions and to finance Lukashenko's regimes or cronies of Lukashenko's. So enforcing sanctions is also one of the most important tasks for Western countries as well. And of course, as a second track, we have to find more efficient instruments to support pro-democratic forces of Belarus. And in my mind, I think some additional funding, specific projects which could support informational activity of pro-democratic forces is of the most importance right now, because as I see, one of the most crucial thing right now is to provide alternative information for Belarusians just staying inside the country, and how to provide all those means to access alternative information, which could be provided by some pro-democratic forces staying in Lithuania or Poland. That should be given the most highest priority right now, because without alternative information, we could not hope, we could not expect that the majority of Belarusians can raise again, or to say can maintain all this hope to create democratic Belarus in the future. So just to be very strict on those two tracks, to implement all the official decisions already made, and to deprive as much financing for Lukashenko's regime as we can, and to divert more financing for democratic forces of Belarus, especially intending to create some alternative information sources. That would be, in my view, just the very first steps right now.
Thank you, Thomas. And this will be the place where I will put the full stop to our panel discussion and question-answer session. And I would like to finish our event with Lisa's overview of our discussion, what she heard here, and what could be her conclusions and recommendations for all of us. Lisa?
Yes, Ugis, thank you very much, and thank you to our panel, to our panelists for this, for their contributions. I think it was a very interesting and diverse mosaic of discussions today, and I have made a lot of notes of various recommendations, or what could be recommendations. Unfortunately, we do not have that much space for discussing them in more detail, because things like, for example, sanctions would require a very sophisticated approach, as Hannah mentioned in her presentation, and followed by the last intervention by Thomas, that there is still a way to go regarding those decisions that had already been made. regarding those sanctions and their implementation. Visa questions and the problems of Belarusians are very important, and the issues that were raised by Sigita and other speakers should be in focus of Western politicians, support for Belarusians in exile in terms of residence permits, visas, mitigating difficulties with opening bank accounts, providing more financial support and diplomatic and expert assistance to Belarusians abroad. More support is needed, more action is needed in the efforts to release political prisoners in Belarus. There was also a recommendation regarding the support to Belarusian volunteers and partisans, which can be one of the ways to support future changes in Belarus and making the deoccupation of Belarus take place sooner. Well, we also discussed the questions of legitimacy and recognizing whom to talk to or whom not to talk to. So Hanna mentioned not only Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as a legitimate representative of Belarusians, but also claimed Lukashenko, who should be kicked out of international organizations and so on. Again, I think some of those points I'm mentioning just en passé because we don't have that much time to go into depth, and I'm sort of enlisting what do Belarusians feel, and that is what I would like to perhaps conclude with, because for me, I think the situation that Belarus appears in at the moment, this historical juncture, reminds me of the situation that Denmark was in during the Second World War. As we know, Denmark was occupied by Germany. And the more I compare their situations, the more I compare their positions, the more it becomes evident for me that Belarusian international position is that of an occupied country at the moment, just like it was when Denmark was occupied by Germany. There is an issue about recognizing Belarus as an occupied country because, well, I think answering this question would also help us to understand what to do and which recommendations to come up with, be it in financial sphere, military sphere, political sphere, diplomatic, and so on and so forth. So answering this very question, is it an occupied country or is it still an independent country, is important. And I would like to highlight here that occupied countries can also have their governments, like recognizing Belarus as an occupied country does not mean that somebody recognize, that it is still, the government is still there, but it's just the government that cooperates with the occupation force, this a historical term, collaborative government. And I think the Danish historical example shows like how unpredictable things can develop, in fact, and that the situation can change depending on the layout of the international circumstances. So I think I will wrap up here and leave 1 minute for my colleagues. Thank you so much for joining this discussion, for spending your time and effort sharing your thoughts and ideas. and recommendations.
Thank you, Lisa, for your conclusions and recommendations. And I think that one thing that keeps me busy now is how could we really get all these things that we discussed here in life, because it is one of our aims to keep all those issues on top of the list. But I would conclude with the phrase that you suggested yourself in the introductory remarks, that actually the keys to many problems in Belarus right now probably lies in Kiev as well. And unfortunately, many Western countries, organizations, governments, politicians, experts, they tend to switch their attention away from Belarus towards Ukraine. But unfortunately or fortunately, more and more attention is paid and should be paid to the situation in Belarus, because it is becoming and very integral part of a bigger puzzle which is going on in the region and in the world. So I guess that all of us, we can be very grateful that we have been following all these things, and we will do that in the future. And our aim and the task is to continue such discussions on different aspects, be it sanctions, be it political changes, or support for democratic society, and be very active, because 2024 and elections are not very far away. So I think it's going to be very challenging probably in the future as well. I would like to thank all the participants of today's discussions and this event, and I would especially like to also thank colleagues from Denmark for providing the place or platform for discussion. Also my colleagues from Latvian Institute of International Affairs. It was really my pleasure to moderate discussion and to see you, to meet you, and hopefully we will meet and see each other soon and on very hot topics. Okay, thank you and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.